from Israel with relations and Deb, I was going to ask you to start, but then let the other panelists answer. And basically do one, if what you say overlaps with other questions, I won't even do them, but aim to try and get 3 questions in and let everyone
for the duration of the
for the moderator panel discussion, and then open it up to the audience.
Would we be able to relate to one another?
Yeah, absolutely.
Where do you want the 2 of us?
You'll sit in a ready to.
You will be flanked by females.
Yes,
I figure any one of these questions overlap, so I'm not gonna read necessarily.
These questions are overlap.
So you're going to group some of the things you shared with us together.
Yeah.
And do 3.
And so many of them are overlapping. Right.
I want you every time I say something to me, ambiguous facial expressions, so I'm not sure if you approve or not.
Do they not have a Jason first?
Yeah, the team is here, but we can start. And we'll get to it.
Stop playing us off.
Marched out, I think.
Good morning, almost good afternoon. I think as people filter in, we're going to get started because irrespective of when we begin, I've been told we will be cut off at 1 o'clock, so everyone can get to the next session. Thank you all for joining us. For anyone who came outside, I hope you didn't get too caught in the rain. This panel is titled Israel's Regional Cooperation, New Opportunities, Old Obstacles, and is presented in cooperation with Mitvim, the Israeli Institute for Regional Foreign Policies. I'll share a couple words on Mitvim before we launch into introductions of the panelists and the conversation. Mitvim was established in 2011 as an independent think tank that aims to reshape Israel's relations in the Middle East, Europe, and the Mediterranean by promoting new paradigms for Israel's foreign policies, enhancing Israel's regional belonging, and advancing Israeli-Arab peace. Mitvim is committed to exploring, formulating, and advocating multiple policy paths that advance a progressive, inclusive, and integrative approach to Israel's regional foreign policies. We are lucky enough to have with us Dr. Nimrod Goren from Mitvim. My name is Rachel Brandenburg. I am the director of the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center's Middle East Security Initiative, and I will be moderating today's discussion. I'm going to ask the panel about 3 to 4 questions and kind of kick off the discussion that way, and then we'll open the floor to questions. And I'll remind you this when we start questions from the audience, but you'll see there's a microphone in the middle, and to ask questions, I'd ask that you line up and speak from that microphone so everyone can hear you, and so that the session is being live streamed, but so the video can hear as well. One last request, please silence any cell phones or other multimedia devices. And now to introduce our panelists. We have immediately to my right, Dr. Nimrod Goren, the founder and head of Mitvim. He also teaches Middle Eastern Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and holds a PhD in Middle Eastern and Political Psychology from Hebrew University. He was formerly executive director of the Young Israeli Forum for Cooperation, and has worked at the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, the Jerusalem Institute for Israel Studies, the Nehemiah Lev Zion Center for Islamic Studies, and at the Harry S. Truman Research Center for the Advancement of Peace. Next to him is Nadav Tamir, currently Director of International Policy and Government Affairs at Perez and Associates Global Advisory Limited, and Senior Advisor for International and Government Relations at the Perez Center for Peace and Innovation. Tamir has served a number of Israeli governments, including during Shimon Peres' presidency, and as the Consul General of Israel to New England in Boston. He has served under Foreign Ministers Shimon Peres, Ehud Barak, and David Levy, in addition to a number of other government positions that, for the sake of time, I won't list. At the end, we have Lucy Kurtzer-Ellenbogen, Director of Israeli-Palestinian Conflict Programs at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where she focuses on the role of Israeli and Palestinian civil society in peacebuilding efforts and the interplay of grassroots and Track 2 efforts with official diplomacy. She's the co-author and author of a number of chapters on Israeli and Palestinian religious peacebuilding efforts, and has a bachelor degree in Arabic and French from Georgetown University and a master's degree from Georgetown's Arabic program with a dual concentration in linguistics and Arab area studies. Daniel Levy is the president of the U.S. Middle East Project based in New York and London. He is an advisor and former Middle East and North Africa program director at the European Council on Foreign Relations. He was formerly director of the New America Foundation's Middle East Task Force and a senior fellow at the Century Foundation. Mr. Levy has worked in the Israeli Prime Minister's office as special advisor and head of Jerusalem affairs, as well as in the office of the Israeli Minister of Justice, Yossi Beilin. He was a member of the official Israeli delegation to the Taba negotiations in January 2001, and had previously served on the Israeli negotiating team to the Oslo B agreement, as well as the lead Israeli drafter of a model peace agreement, the Geneva Initiative. Sorry, I'm losing my papers. And now to turn to some questions. I think we can all agree the news from the Middle East, whether positive, negative, whatever you view it, has been relatively endless. We've probably all seen what happened in Syria this weekend, over the past few years. If you follow the news about the Middle East in the United States at all, it was hard to miss the Saudi Crown Prince's 2+ week visit to the United States and now in Europe. We're seeing relations between Israel and Jordan and Israel and Egypt closer than ever before. But in the meantime, a lack of nearly any progress between Israelis and Palestinians within Israel and the Palestinian territories. So to ask the first question, to our panelists, and I'd like to start with Nadav, and then anyone else is welcome to chime in. What is the outlook from within Israel, in your opinion, and in particular vis-a-vis relations with Israel's neighbors? And what's changed? Are there any reasons for optimism?
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. Both J Street and Mitvim are two organizations that are very dear to my heart, and both of them represent a new, fresh voice that is so needed. So I'm happy to be part of this. I'm a little nervous because the Celtics are going to play at 1 o'clock, and it's the first playoff game, but I'll try to keep my mind here. Of course, as someone who worked for Shimon Peres, everything for me is an opportunity. But I actually think that even if you put that aside, the strategic change in the Arab world, outlook towards Israel is a huge opportunity that is kind of missed sometimes from the Israeli perspective. If you think where the Arab world was after the '67 war with the 3 no's of the Khartoum summit, no to Israel, no to negotiation, no to recognition, and now we have an Arab peace initiative on the table for so long, which actually says, just solve this problem with the Palestinians and we will normalize relations because we have other issues to deal with. Unfortunately, in Israel, the common wisdom is to look at every development from the worst case scenario. So the people thought, okay, what was the trap? What was the, little language that that is going to put Israel on the defensive? The challenge with this opportunity is that, that those who see the Israeli-Palestinian conflict not in terms of win-win, but in terms of zero-sum, think that they could use this, better relations and alliance of interest between Israel and the Arab world as a way to bypass the Palestinian issue. And this is not going to happen not only because, the street, definitely after the Arab Spring, the street is not going to let any Arab leaders put the Palestinian issue aside, but I think it also goes against the Israeli interest because with all the issues around us, the most existential issue is the Palestinian one, because that is the only issue that actually is a threat to the identity of Israel as a homeland for the Jewish people and the democracy. And that is why we have to do whatever we can to use this new outlook in the Arab world. And I think that I'm hoping that whatever the Trump ultimate proposal that we're all waiting to will do that. I have some concerns that maybe certain people are trying to actually create a rift between the Palestinians and the more pro-American, I don't want to say moderate, but pro-American Sunni countries in order to say again the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. Here the Egyptians, the Saudis are for the deal and the Palestinians are not. I hope that it will be a proposal that the Palestinians and the Arab countries could support. And when you see the language of the Arab Peace Initiative, you see that it's very much in line with the interest of everybody who wants to support the two-state solution. And I hope that the Trump deal will respect those parameters that are very much a consensus for everybody who wants to achieve peace in the Middle East.
Thank you. Imran, would you like to add anything?
I will relate to the change of the Israeli discourse regarding the regional issues, because we see how the Israeli society is moving in its perception of regional affairs. When the Arab Spring began, the dominant discourse in Israel was a very negative framing of regional events, presenting the pro-democracy forces in the Middle East as ones who will be leading eventually to major security threats for Israel taking shape. And over the last few years, we see the Israeli discourse changing from a very threat-focused one to one that is giving more and more space to opportunities, like Nadav mentioned. But the problem is that the opportunities that are being viewed are not necessarily the ones that are actually there, and the path towards their fulfillment are sometimes different than what public perceives. And I will elaborate very shortly on that, because Israelis are now less looking into the hopes for normal ties with the Arab world on civilian issues, like we saw in the 90s, and are settling for quite much less than that, and are quite happy if there are security coordination behind the scenes with some major Arab countries against Iran. That's it. And by doing that, they are missing the big potential that lies in relations between Israel and the Arab world on economic issues, in civilian issues, in diplomatic issues, and mostly on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Because Israel and Saudi Arabia should not cooperate against Iran as the first priority. They should cooperate about bringing peace between Israelis and Palestinians.
Can I ask you to elaborate on one piece of that? Have you seen what is the reason for that among Israeli public opinion?
So first of all, our Prime Minister is doing, from his point of view, a very effective job since 2014 in advocating this flip of sequence. The Arab Peace Initiative that has been in place for now more than 15 years says very clearly normal ties between Israel and the Arab world is possible, but for that to happen, the conflict should be resolved first. And the Prime Minister and his ministers are talking about changing the sequence, meaning Israel can first have good relation with the Arab world, and then maybe later move forward with the Palestinians. This doesn't resonate with most of the Arab leadership, and I think that's why it's flawed, although it gains more and more traction within the Israeli public opinion, even within left-wing voters.
Thank you. I think to further this conversation, a question that, Daniel, if you can start out with. So given that this is where the Israeli public discourse is, we also hear a lot about Israel from internationals, from policymakers, from in the media, that Israel and the Sunni Arab Gulf states should be looking to cooperate vis-a-vis Iran. And if any time there's an opportunity, this is one. I'd be interested in your views on that. And if not Iran, what other opportunities or lack thereof do you see in the region right now for further cooperation?
Yeah, I think that Nadav and Nimrod have made if I can extract from both your comments a core point that I think is important and absolutely against the grain of where Israel's leadership is, as you've both noted, which is, look, the premise was you get the Arab states on board, that creates added incentives for Israel to make a peace deal with the Palestinians. It helps market that deal. They're more reliable than the unreliable Palestinians, and it helps give backing to whatever concessions the Palestinians might need to make. The Arab Peace Initiative, as has been mentioned, 15 years old. Israel didn't take yes for an answer. It got yes for an answer and was not interested. Which means the entire premise of that is irrelevant under a Netanyahu government who has no intention of going towards peace. Netanyahu has made an attempt at an end run around that on the premise that you just mentioned, Rachel. Peace without the Palestinians, with the Arab world, or I think more accurately I would describe it as peace with as many Arab states as possible against the Palestinians. And my expectation is whatever the Trump administration comes up with, if it comes up with anything, will be an attempt to impose a diktat on the Palestinians, trying to leverage certain Gulf states and perhaps one of Israel's immediate neighbors with whom it has peace in pushing the Palestinians to accept something that won't meet the minimum threshold. The premise is you can get on board with this because we, Israel, and you, some of the Gulf states, some of the Arab states, especially in the Gulf, share this bigger challenge, which is Iran. Now, I think that is a misreading of the biggest, most existential, most consequential issue that Israel has to deal with, which is what Nadav said. Fascinatingly, it's what, in an interview in the Israeli press a couple of weeks ago during the Chagim, the former heads of the Mossad kind of came together on, which is Israel stands or fails on what happens between the state of Israel and the 6+ million Palestinians who are either second-class citizens of Israel, directly occupied by Israel in the West Bank, part of a reconfigured occupation in Gaza, in the twilight zone of Jerusalem, or in the Palestinian diaspora in neighboring countries. So the attempt is to say, no, that's not the priority. The priority is somewhere else, and on that basis, we can work together. I think we're still in the moment where the Israeli government is testing how far it can go with that. How far can it push the envelope? And I think from the perspective of a government that wants to have better relations without doing anything constructive on the Palestinian front, the signs so far are somewhat encouraging, especially when you have a Trump administration buy-in to this notion. And so I think for Netanyahu, the question is, how far can we test this? How far can we go with Saudi Arabia, with the UAE, with others? What matters most to me, and I think they will be able to get a certain distance, I no longer am fully convinced by something that Nadav said, which is they won't be able to put the Palestinian issue on the back burner. Because I do think that you also have a young Saudi crown prince who is testing the proposition that his cohort of 20 and 30-something young Saudis, the majority of the Saudi population, don't particularly care about the Palestinian issue. I'm not sure where I'd place my bet in terms of who's right on that. What I would bet is that it's a misplaced strategy for Israel to think that there's a lot of advantage for Israel in involving itself across the region in an axis that will be weak, with allies who aren't doing spectacularly well. We're actually trying to align ourselves with the losing side in the region. And I would take a step back and say this is an entirely misplaced concept when it comes to how Israel should approach Iran, and whether we should be interested in an escalation and a zero-sum approach also on the Iran question, or whether we should be interested in diplomacy, de-escalation. And yes, Israel and Iran are going to have very fundamental differences, but can they be managed more effectively and less kinetically without Israel aligning itself in a broader regional struggle, which will only increase sectarianism, violence, radicalization, all of which blow back and do not serve Israel's interests?
Thank you. Lucy.
Yeah, I think that much has already been said that I would agree with on this issue. I just add a little bit of texture on a few of these points. So I agree with Daniel. I think there's mutual testing going on. I think particularly you're seeing that with the Saudi leadership and with the Netanyahu government, testing of how far you can push this proposition of it's not even so much going around the Palestinians or about the Palestinian issue, but how far you can push absent doing anything on that, on strengthening relations. And as I think Daniel said, there's been some success so far. I mean, there's definitely increased cooperation happening at many levels between Israel and a number of countries. The question becomes, again, as I think Daniel raised, how true is this belief I think people have had for a while that there's ultimately a glass ceiling to where that cooperation goes until the peace process is resolved and addressed. I still tend to believe that is the case. I think the challenge is, do the respective leaders need that? Is it enough for these leaders to be enjoying the cooperation on these shared strategic interests as they have it, without having, as particularly for the case of the Arab leaders, to test that proposition further of what the street will do? So when you look at polling on this, and as we know, polling is notoriously more difficult to get a credible handle on when it comes to public opinion polling in the Arab world than, say, among the Israeli and even Palestinian publics. But if you look at the Zogby poll, for example, and he's been doing polling in the Arab world, and he does the Arab countries and Turkey. He usually polls on these questions. And his most recent poll, I think it was at the end of 2017, looked at Arab world and Turkish attitudes to this particular issue. Is what do we think about, what do you think about the proposition of strengthening ties with Israel in order to address these common shared threats, extremism, Iran specifically? And I think the numbers were instructive. I think your highest numbers you got 59% of Egyptians, 48% of Saudis, 45% of Emiratis, and 51% of Iraqis said yes to strengthening relations, but if, and only if, after you've addressed the issue of occupation of the Palestinians and addressed a peace agreement along with the parameters of the Arab Peace Initiative. To look at this another way, if you wanted to look at those countries that said we should do it anyway regardless of that, the highest numbers you got of support for that were 16% in Lebanon and 25% in Turkey. So again, to the extent we place meaning in these polls, what you are seeing is this Palestinian issue does need to be addressed first before we're willing to talk openly or think openly. Again, this is public opinion polling. Now, I'm looking at actually Ben on the front row here. He and I had a conversation relatively recently about this issue, and he reminded me of a concept, I think, in social psychology called pluralistic ignorance, where is there some phenomenon going on here where everybody thinks everybody else thinks that way, right? That people on the Arab street think, well, it's probably not popular to think it's okay to normalize with Israel, and therefore, who knows? We just don't know, and I think that's where the testing is happening. But all to say, I feel fairly solidly that the Arab leadership isn't willing, with all its concerns domestically and around it, to take that risk right now. And it doesn't necessarily feel like it has to, as long as it's probably getting some of the cooperation that it is getting around the issues that are happening.
Thank you. One follow-on question from that. We saw before and after the December 6th announcement that President Trump made about recognizing Jerusalem, before, quite an expectation of major protests across the Arab world, if not violence. During and after, there were protests, there were a lot of statements, but not nearly to the extent that was predicted. Should we read into that at all as sort of a test of some of the polling numbers?
I certainly think the leaderships all around were probably looking at that as a test. My own view on this is it's too soon to tell. So certainly, and thankfully, there was less violence than was feared. Actually, violent incidents did go up actually in the West Bank. If you look at the statistics since December 6th, specifically in the West Bank. But if you're looking more broadly in the Arab world, yes, the reaction was relatively muted. So I think that the leadership is seeing that as a test of the Israeli leadership, some of the Arab leaders, maybe the Trump administration. I think I would be wary of us all being too complacent about that. There's a long way to go on this issue. There's, we'll see what happens when the embassy opens. There's things that could happen to test the patience all around of all sides up on the Temple Mount. And again, this issue does tend to still have symbolic resonance and has a long history of being able to be exploited by actors who are feeling pushed to do that. And so again, I think on some level you were seeing with that muted reaction, the fact that I think has also been acknowledged up here, that the leadership and people around the Middle East, around the Arab world, have a lot of other concerns on their mind. And this isn't first and foremost the issue right now. But again, I do think it's too soon to write this off as, look, it was nothing and Jerusalem really doesn't resonate anymore. I think we have to play this out a bit more.
Sorry, no more.
Now, just would like to put it in the context also of the July 2017 tensions in Jerusalem around the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the metal detectors, because there as well, when you look at the reaction of the Arab leadership in the neighboring countries, despite the sensitivity of the mosque and what it means and what was happening around it, and despite a very clear position that they were taking against Israeli policies, they were always very concerned about what happens domestically within their own countries, how to restrain people from going to the streets in a way that can jeopardize that. So I think part of the reaction to American moves is not only about what is the perception about Trump's policy, but also looking inwards. And in that regard, I think it's worth noting Israel's relation with Jordan, because when we look about and we talk about improvements in relation between Israel and the Arab countries, this is not the case with all of the Arab countries. And there are quite a number of important Arab countries with which the relationship is not going forward. We talk about the Saudis. The Saudis were always even behind the Gulf states in their cooperation and interaction with Israel. But Israel had about 6 months of a major crisis with Jordan, a long time without an Israeli ambassador in Jordan, and all of the major cooperation projects, whether economic or civilian, with Jordan have almost been put on freeze. So the Saudis are one aspect, but there are other countries for which ignoring the Palestinian issue is much more difficult or even impossible.
Including Turkey.
And I can say something about that later.
Yeah, I was going to bring us a little bit closer to Israel's borders, but Daniel, you had a comment.
I mean, just on this point, I mean, it did reflect existing lines of polarization in the Arab world, of course, the response and what was allowed to happen in the public domain in the response on the Jerusalem embassy. But I also wouldn't underestimate the significance that when President Erdogan convened in Istanbul the Organization of the Islamic Conference, despite significant pressures being exerted on Jordanian King Abdullah and on President Abbas, they attended that meeting at the highest level, a meeting with the President of Iran, the Emir of Qatar, the significance of that at this moment, for them to stand alongside him, a number of other leaders from the Arab world. There was, I mean, you see, this is you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. If it turns violence, then, you see, they're violent. If it's not violent, but there are relatively large manifestations of popular protest, they're ignored, of course. So there were some, and the other thing which I found interesting is in many respects you saw more of a popular mobilization in Indonesia, not an insignificant country, and in other places beyond the Arab world.
Thank you. So bringing us a little bit closer to Israel's borders, I was going to ask about Syria and what I've been hearing Israel talk about for at least the past year is the coming northern war. What you've been able to find both opportunities and challenges and sort of many other openings across the region. So looking north from Israel, how does that change the calculus, or does it? Does it present opportunities in terms of building relations with other Arab states, to include Jordan and Egypt? There's sort of other shared concerns for some of the countries closer to Israel. And what challenges does it present for looking beyond there?
I think that the major factor that we should have to look at, talking about Syria, is the fact that America is moving away from the region. And a lot of what we see in Syria is that. Putting aside the last attack, I think the last attack is not representing America, who still wants to be very involved. You know, in Israel, many people blamed it on Obama, that he doesn't want to show leadership, that he's weak, but I believe that it's much more structural, that America is losing interest in the Middle East because of many good reasons, unfortunately. One is energy independence. The other is all the attempts to intervene in the Middle East were a big failure. So the American public, the American decision makers don't see any advantage of being very involved in the Middle East. And this is one of the things we see in Syria, that the countries that are meeting to decide what's going to happen in Syria, the new Sykes-Picot after defeating ISIS, are Turkey, Iran, and Russia. Now, I think for Israel, America moving out of the Middle East is very worrying, because the vacuum is going to be filled by countries that are not necessarily always negative. I don't think Russia is negative towards Israel. It's just that for Russia, Israel is not a significant interest. And for America, it is. So Israel should do whatever we can to keep America engaged in a constructive way. Unfortunately, in the last especially during the Obama administration, we did everything possible to make the Middle East less attractive. Whenever America tried to use diplomacy to solve Iran or to bring peace about, Israel was not a team player, on the contrary. And I think there are things that we could do to keep America involved. One of them, and I know it doesn't sound very popular in this audience, is a contractual defense alliance. And I will say a few words why I think it's good for peace and not bad for peace. It's good for peace for several reasons. One of them is that I think that the IDF, who's now the most progressive arm of the Israeli government and understand better than the politicians the limit of hard power, will have more reasons to resist any populist attempt by politicians to involve the military in actions, and it will actually have restraining power over Israel getting involved in adventures. And the second one is that to have an alliance, you need borders. You can't really have an alliance without clear borders, because then how do you define where is the place that you protect? And I think it will force Israel and make America force Israel to have borders. The other way to keep America involved, I thought, was to accept the General Allen plan, which was, General Allen was nominated by Secretary Kerry to find a solution to the Israeli concerns about security in a peace process. The IDF professionals were pretty supportive, but the politicians were against. I think the General Allen is a great way to both help bring peace about and also keep America more involved. I would say that even though I'm usually critical over many things my government is doing, I think on the Syria front, we behave pretty rationally. I think Israel couldn't be really involved in a constructive way, even though what Assad is doing is horrific, especially for Jews. But nothing that we could have done would make things better. And the policy to kind of act only when it's kind of, moving weapons that are problematic to Israel on the one hand, and doing humanitarian work in accepting Syrian people to Israeli hospitals was the right policy. But as I said, because of the fact that America is no longer there, I think that we're going to face some bigger challenges in the future.
Lucy.
Yeah, I just want to address this question of the impact, whether it's opportunities or challenges of what's going on that northern border. And I think that in the immediate term, this is one of the gravest security concerns, and a real security concern, as Nadav was indicating, for Israel. I think when we look at how that impacts the other question we're talking about here, on the level of psychology, frankly, for Israelis and what that might mean for any forward move in the peace process, this presents a real challenge. I remember listening to a couple of years ago to an Israeli general who drew the distinction between security and defense capability, and talking about how the former is a state of mind. So Israel is incredibly strong when it comes to defense capability, but in terms of its feelings of security, we know that for Israel, this is a genuinely held concern. And when Israel looks around right now and it sees its northern border with Lebanon, and it sees what's happening in the northeast with Syria, and then if you compound that with what you've been seeing in Gaza recently, I think the idea that this will increase an appetite among the Israeli publics to want to take the risk they see moving towards peace of the Palestinians, I think this only complicates that matter. So I think that's something for us also to throw into the mix here in terms of the bigger picture.
Thanks. Yeah, I think I see Daniel and Nimrod raising their microphones, but after this question, after these comments, I will turn to the audience. So if you do have questions and you want to start lining up, we'll get to you in a couple moments. Go ahead.
What Lucy said is important, that Syria, Israel played the role that Nadav outlined, but the trajectory of the overall conflict in Syria has become increasingly clear, and who has the upper hand, Israel is facing a genuine dilemma, which is deterrence is normally about deterring someone from doing something in your territorial space. Israel is trying to extend that to preventing someone from doing something in Syria in terms of the kind of build-up, the kind of deployment. And that's going to be a very hard choice to make. Israel is used to a certain freedom of maneuver in Lebanon, for instance, that it would like to apply in Syria, and I don't think that's going to be doable other than a huge cost, and a cost that isn't worth achieving that. What that translates into, for me, is partly why one needs to question whether the reliance on an America deployment strategy and trying to build this new axis in the region that doubles down on everything is adversarial with Iran, and one cannot reach even quiet understandings whether that is a smart strategy, and clearly I'm suggesting it's not. And to go back to what we were discussing, and what Nadav just said about American, the ending of that American role in the region. I think, by the way, Friday night strike was indicative, because the strike was a big nothing burger. Now, I'm glad, I actually am against, if you want to change the dynamics of the Syria conflict, you have to own that conflict, you have to deploy as massively as you deployed in Iraq, and I don't think the outcome will be any better. But I think where Israel and Saudi and others, I think much of what's really behind it isn't so much what they can do jointly together, but both pushing to try and keep America militarily deployed and as the security guarantor in the region. And I'm not sure they're going to be successful on that basic front. So there's one other aspect in which this plays out that's worth referencing. With Egypt, it doesn't really play into the relationship. Syria, because Egypt has taken a different role on the Syria conflict. With Jordan, what you're seeing is the Jordanians basically saying, hey, we have all these interests in our shared border with Syria. You know how important the work we're doing is. America, you know how important the work we're doing is. Why do you keep squeezing us and making our political domestic position so untenable vis-a-vis Jerusalem, vis-a-vis the behavior on the Palestinian issue, vis-a-vis the way Prime Minister Netanyahu embraced the returning Israeli security guard who had just shot a couple of Jordanian citizens. So the Jordanians are feeling very, very nervous and squeezed right now because of the way both the Israelis and the Americans are operating in a relationship that is really important. And of course, unlike the other players, For Jordan, the Palestinian issue is existential.
Nimrod, did you have comments?
Yeah, sure.
And we'll turn to the audience.
So a word about Jordan, also the fact that you hear more and more right-wing politicians in Israel saying that the peace treaty between Israel and Jordan is really of no benefit to Israel because the Jordanians should be thankful for Israel to keep the Jordanian regime in place. And you hear therefore Likud MKs, and this gets top headlines in the Jordanian media and creates real damage. Now, the Syrian issue, first of all, is another example how the Netanyahu security narrative doesn't deliver. No, Netanyahu had his operations vis-a-vis the Iran deal, which is in place. He has this story about Israel's relation with Russia and how Israel manages to kind of operate Russia towards Israel's interests, and this isn't the case, as we see recently. So when we talk about the Netanyahu positioning on security issues, I think this could be a tool for the Israeli progressive camp to challenge that. Now, there is another argument that we hear more and more that a conflict in the north is inevitable. I think this is a very dangerous narrative to get accustomed to. But in order to challenge it, it's not only about security, it's also about diplomacy. And that's where the weakness of the Israeli Foreign Service is definitely creating damage. Israel should reach out or should be able to cooperate both with its traditional allies in Western Europe, which it is adopting a very confrontational language towards because of the Palestinian issue, but also to other regional actors. And Dav, you mentioned briefly Turkey, and Daniel, you mentioned Erdogan. Israelis tend to see Turkey as an ally of Iran regarding Syria, but that's not the case. You know, Turkey and Iran has lots of rivalry on Syria. And if Israel would have managed to create a dialogue, a policy dialogue with the Turks on limiting Iranian influence in Syria, not militarily but politically and economically, I think it will find good partners in Ankara.
Thank you. First question from the audience.
Hi, I'm Andy Winnick. I teach in LA. I have a question. I had an interaction with William Burns recently, and we were talking about something about the following. You now have, and you haven't mentioned it, the Trump administration with Bolton and Pompeo, all three of whom would just love to have a war with Iran. You have a Saudi prince who sees himself in a major competition in terms of the Sunni Shia thing and the crescent from Iran. You have Netanyahu who's facing going to jail on various corruption charges, who desperately needs a distraction, and a war with Iran would be just fine. A lot of us are very concerned that that triumphant of people could really get us into a war in the relatively near future, and I'm wondering what your sense is of that.
One more question as well.
Hi, my name is Elliot Davis, and I'm a student studying at Duke University. You had spoken about the role that Israel should play in trying to promote peace to Palestinians and the steps that they should take. But I'm curious to hear of what steps you think that the Arab government should take in regards to getting Palestinians to come to the table and helping them, whether it being helping them economically or trying to get another set of leadership in Gaza instead of Hamas, and other ways that the Arab governments can help Palestinians aside from what Israel should do. Thank you.
Thank you. So 2 questions. First, to summarize, how concerned should we be about war with Iran, in particular given various political dynamics here and in Israel and in the Gulf? And second, what steps should Arab governments take vis-a-vis the Palestinians to help move toward a peace process? Would anyone like to begin?
Okay, in terms of Iran, I would separate between the rhetoric of Netanyahu and the actual actions, because the defense establishment in Israel think that tearing down the Iran, the JCPOA, it will be a big mistake and will actually let Iran go directly into a bomb, because there will be no coalition anymore. And the thought that, that it's just for America to decide when we're talking about P5+1 is ridiculous. So I think that some of it is rhetoric because of political reasons, because of other things, but I don't think that Israel it will, has any interest to go into conflict, or so I would try to look behind the headlines. In terms of what the Arab world could do, there was an attempt by Egypt to create reconciliation between Fatah and Hamas that failed. They're still kind of going through the motions, but it seems that both sides are not interested. The Palestinian Authority, they hate Hamas maybe more than Israel, especially after the last assassination attempt. They also don't want to be in a situation like in Lebanon, where they have the responsibility of the civilian stuff, while Hamas still control the weapons and do what they want. So they can't really achieve anything. But I think that even if we cannot get full reconciliation, it is within Israel's interest that there will be a joint government, maybe a technocrat government, because I think that will help Hamas find a ladder, to move a little out of the ideological rhetoric, because Hamas are failing in controlling Gaza, and there's a lot of resentment within Gaza, and this is one of the reasons also for the demonstration, because they are looking for a way to let people ventilate in a way that will be towards Israel and not towards them. I definitely think that the Arab world could do a much better job in supporting state building for the Palestinians, and also in affecting the Trump plan in a way that will be constructive and will not marginalize the Palestinian moderates.
Thanks, Nimrod.
Yeah, I would like to relate to the second question on the Arab world, and say that first and foremost, the Arab countries should be part of a formal international mechanism that is dealing with the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. The only mechanism now is the quartet. The quartet hasn't been as effective in the past. Under Trump, it may be even less effective. The Americans are not giving much space to other countries to be involved, but there were debates about expanding quartet or creating some sort of another international mechanism that must include the Arab countries within it, because the Arab state has much to contribute. The Arab Peace Initiative is one example. The Arab attempts at mediating between Fatah and Hamas is another example. They should have a seat on the table. And their support doesn't only go directly to the Palestinian side, it also goes to the Israeli side, and by that impact the landscape of negotiations. For example, the fact that the Arab world continuously reaffirms the Arab Peace Initiative year after year under a different climate between Israelis and Palestinians, and has been also willing to adapt the language a bit when John Kerry was just about to embark on his talks, show that the Arab world really wants to contribute to peacemaking, and it should push back on efforts by the American administration to kind of use them as a dividing tool between the Palestinians and the Arab state, as was mentioned by previous speakers.
I disagree with something, so I'm going to seize the opportunity. In addressing that second point, I mean, first of all, there's no Arab world. Obviously, they're deeply divided within themselves. But I would say that this is not about helping with state building. It's not about creating another mechanism that can be a quartet plus another quartet. We've been there. We've tried it. Let's not fool ourselves. This is about, if we want it, ending an occupation, and how do you leverage a different incentive and disincentive structure for Israel. Israel has been offered peace with the Arab world. It's not interested. I was in Tel Aviv last week, where I am frequently. Why would anyone want to do anything differently? It is all going swimmingly, unless you begin to impact. And this is where the Arab world could have real leverage. Yes, continue to hold out the Arab Peace Initiative, but say, in the absence of the acceptance of a 15-year-old plan, and with the ever more egregious steps being taken by Israel, actually we have to show the other end of the equation. We have to show that we are serious about taking steps to get your attention, to create a disincentive for you to carry on. And the Arab world is powerful enough to be able to do that. That is not going to happen. Let me be clear. But if you were to ask me what would be the most effective thing they could do, that would be it. That requires a very different Palestinian leadership, a very different assertion of Palestinian agency and strategy, and an ability to embarrass and cajole Arab actors, which we don't have today. But that, unfortunately, is probably going to be the direction it would have to go in. Let me say one thing on Iran. I don't talk about John Bolton too much because I like to at least hold out the prospect of sleeping at night. But I'm deeply concerned, and I would just draw a contrast between what we see in the Middle East when it comes to how do you manage this dangerous and unpredictable administration, and what we're seeing on the Korean Peninsula with the I'm not a Korea expert, but I am taken by what looks to me extremely smart, pragmatic leadership by the South Korean president, who's basically saying, we're going to have to live with whatever lunacy comes out of this administration. We better take the initiative, try to control the dynamics of this. They made the outreach to the North Koreans. They're trying to drive a process forward. We see the opposite, unfortunately, amongst the closest players to the Trump administration in the Middle East, including Netanyahu and his government, which is to continue to walk these lunatics higher up a ladder, and that is very dangerous.
I mean, I agree with pieces of them that have been said, so I think maybe we'll move to the long line of questions here.
Let's take at least 2, possibly 3 questions, but go ahead, sir.
Good morning. My name is Bruce Waxman, and my credentials are that I'm a supporter of J Street. And listening to all of these experts, one thing jumped out at me that maybe just my lack of depth of understanding, but you made multiple references to the Arab Street in various ways as being a factor in the relationship potentially between Israel and some of these countries. And I don't really grasp that. I looked at the Arab Spring, which is to me kind of like spring in Siberia. And I look at what happened with regard to Mubarak and General Sisi. These countries, you look at Saudi Arabia, all these countries don't seem to me to have any semblance of democracy. They're basically, as far as I can tell, again, not as an expert, tightly controlled, whether it's by secret police or other mechanisms. Certainly the King of Jordan is not a Palestinian, as my understanding would be a large portion, if not the majority of the population of Jordan is. So how does the Arab Street become really a player when there really is, to me, as far as I can see, not much of a voice for this Arab Street in these conditions of these countries? Thank you.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi, my name is Josh Schwartz. Nadav, you said that Russia is kind of agnostic towards Israel, that it's not against, it's not for, but if Russia seems to be aligning with an axis that is antagonistic towards Israel, at what point do you think the daylight between Israel and Russia will really heat up? And recently we've been seeing back and forth between Netanyahu and Putin that, you know, Putin is not happy with the strike that just happened in Syria. So firstly, where do you see that relationship developing? And also, what leverage does Israel have as Russia becomes more of a major player, both militarily and economically in the region, for exerting pressure on Russia? Thanks.
Thanks. And in the interest of getting to all the questions, let's take another one.
Hi, my name is Matan, and I'm a student at Haverford College. I'm wondering what you make of recent overtures in the Gulf towards Jewish organizations, and in particular Zionist organizations and far-right Zionist organizations like the ZOA and Mort Klein, how that fits into their strategy.
Great. I'll summarize the questions. There are 3 very different questions, so you can each choose which you'd like to answer. The first was the Arab Street. How can it be productive or constructive in the context of a peace process, given what we've seen of the Arab Street over the last few years? The second question was Russia and Russia-Israel relations. And to summarize in my own words, where is it going? And do you view it as more ideological or pragmatic? And then the third was what to make of Gulf overtures to a number of Israeli Jewish organizations, including some like the Zionist Organization of America and Mort Klein that tend to be more conservative. Lucy, do you want to start?
Certainly. So I'll taking that first question about how significant really is the Arab Street and does its leadership, the way I understood your question, really have to worry about where it is. I think, yes, certainly these countries are not democracies, but I actually take a different conclusion, draw a different conclusion than you do from the Arab Spring, which is, I think, if nothing else, the Arab Spring cemented for a lot of leaders in the region that gone are the days, if they were there at all, where you could just ignore whatever the Arab Street thought. Because however authoritarian, non-democratic. Your regime may be at various levels, depending on what country we're talking about. I think these leaders are still keenly aware that, particularly in an age of social media, globalization, etc., that your street's opinions does have implications and could ultimately have implications for you. So I do think there is concern, even in these countries where you don't have a democratic system, the way we think of public opinion mattering. The second question, I think, was directed specifically towards Nadav, so I'll let him take that one first. On the third question about what do we make of this outreach, I think some of this all falls again into the category of testing the waters. I think for some leaders as well, it's sending a signal. One of the things you've heard many Israelis say, or I've heard many Israelis say for a while, is, the Arab Peace Initiative was put down as a take it or leave it. There needs to be some kind of signs that how do we trust? How do we trust that at the end of the day that's what we get? And so in some cases it's possibly some signaling that, look, we're serious, that we would be willing to push even further if you solve this problem. And I think for some leaders, they are very keen to make the point. The meetings have been a lot with American Jewish organizations, and some of these leaders, I think, are keen to make the point that they are drawing a distinction, that their problem is not with the religion, with Judaism, but it's specifically with Israeli policy. So I think there are a number of different dynamics at play factoring into that question.
Okay, so first of all, I agree with Lucy that there is a change in the Arab world, even if it's not Jeffersonian democracies. If you would have come to France a few years after the French Revolution, you wouldn't see liberté, fraternité, égalité. You would see Robespierre cutting heads and Jacobian terrorism. So I think the movement is that there is much more respect for public opinion, and even Sisi is much more tuned to the public than Mubarak ever was. So it will take time, but there is a change, and the people and the street is much more concerned about the Palestinian issue, not because they love the Palestinians, because they feel it as an open wound for Muslims and Arabs in general. In terms of Russia, we don't have a lot of levers with Russia, because, as I said, for Russia, even though the bilateral relations are good, for Russia, Israel is not a big issue, and they have other issues that are much more important for them. I think, it would be good if we find ways to get Russia to be more constructive. For example, on the peace process, the position of Russia on the embassy issue, I think, was pretty good. They said, West Jerusalem is definitely the Israeli capital, but East Jerusalem should have a Palestinian capital in it. So, as Nimrod said, I think we need those players to be much more a part of a quartet or P5+1 plus Arab. We need those players, and maybe if Israel give Russia a role there, which I'm not sure I can expect from the current government, we could also have more leverage with them on the front. In terms of the last question, I think that we actually see another way of maybe positive anti-Semitism. Many people really believe in the power of the Jewish community in American politics, which I don't think they're wrong about. Of course, now in the past when the relations were more bipartisan, so it was easier maybe to move it to more, but now it's when Israel became a political football, then I think they're looking for parts of the Jewish community that are ideologically on the side of who cares about human rights, who cares about democracy. Let's just think realpolitik, and that's why they're trying to get influence in Washington through Jewish organizations.
Thank you.
Just on that last question, because I think it's important in terms of what's been going on with the Gulf and certain Jewish visitors in different parts of the Gulf, etc. There are three things going on here. One is not new at all. There have been delegations of American Jewish organizations traveling to different countries in the Gulf for many, many, many years, preceded the Arab Peace Initiative, after the Arab Peace Initiative recently. So part of this is pretty standard outreach. There's a second part of this, which is very specific to the shakedown moment we are in, which is this dispute within the Gulf, within the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, where you have the Qataris being an attempt to isolate Qatar, led by Saudi and the UAE, and Bahrain is part of that, and the other Gulf states have sat on the sidelines. In that context, the big winner in that fight is the American lobbyists, is K Street, who are milking all these very wealthy Gulf states and having a blast. And they're literally, they say, oh, today we'll attack this one, you attack that one, and then we can charge them more because they've got... And in that context, in the context of what Nadav said, they're trying to bring over American Jewish delegations because you have influence, you have power, and that's the major context. The third is this other context, which is somewhat new, what we've been discussing throughout this panel, of this attempt to test the water on closer relations between Israel and some of the Gulf states. In that respect, I mean, let me just add 2 points on that. And obviously the American Jewish organizations play in that space. I just want to put out the thought here that the Israeli side and the Saudi Emirati side, part of the testing of the water is who's going to do the heavy lifting. And I think each may have unrealistic expectations of, oh, but you're taking care of that. I wonder how far we can drag the Israelis into this. Or I wonder how far on the other side we can drag the Gulfies into that. For me, it was a very instructive moment when the Prime Minister of Lebanon, Saad Hariri, apparently involuntarily extended his stay in Saudi Arabia. And people were saying, wow, is this going to be the moment where Israel takes the opportunity to this northern conflict? Is this the moment where you're going to see Israeli action in Lebanon? And no, Israel was not going to take action in Lebanon at a time and in a way of Saudi choosing. So you saw the limitations of this. And one last comment on it. There's another component to this, which is just worth mentioning. For Prime Minister Netanyahu, the perception of ever close relations with the Gulf, which is part accurate, but also still rather limited. But that perception is an important part of his domestic political sales pitch. Netanyahu's sales pitch is, number one, the nasty traitors on the left are trying to kick me out in a vast media conspiracy, yada, yada, yada. Number two, not only have we not witnessed what those same nasty traitors kept telling you would happen, which is Israel being isolated, marginalized, pariah status, but actually our relations with the world are better than ever. And for him to be able to say that includes Arab states and to not be contradicted, that's very helpful. And occasionally he can point to a visiting Saudi or a visiting Bahraini or an office opening in the UAE for the Energy Renewables Association.
Okay, quick comment from Nimrod, and then we'll take the last 3 questions.
What is happening in the Arab Street, especially after the Arab Spring, did not perhaps bring the democracy that some of us at least hope to see in the Arab countries, but it did change the perception in Israel about the Arab countries, seeing them in a much more nuanced way, not as a monolithic bloc, giving much more respect to the Arab publics that are willing to step up and confront their authoritarian regimes and call for their rights. It also opened up the public sphere in some Arab countries in a way that led to the establishment of new civil society organizations. You see more and more think tanks in the Arab world, and for us, as an Israeli think tank, that's a new channel of organization we can communicate with, and this is going on quite nicely. Surprisingly, under the year of Muslim Brotherhood control in Egypt, we saw Egyptian commentators, young Egyptian students, some of them female with headscarves, speaking Hebrew, commentating live on Israeli TV about what's happening in Egypt, so giving Israelis a very different view than what you used to hear from generals only. So those dynamics did reflect somehow on how Israelis view the Middle East and how channels of engagement can happen. And a word on the meeting with the delegation, the Jewish delegation, one anecdote is in the same week that the Israeli embassy here in Washington criticized the Jewish orgs for meeting the Qataris. It was our Minister for Regional Cooperation, Tzachi Hanegbi, who was reportedly meeting with the Qatari envoy to Gaza in Israel. So it was kind of contradicting what you expect from the Jewish community and what we do on ourselves. And please note that why are only right-wing conservative Jews taking part in these delegations? where is the leadership of the progressive pro-peace camp in the Jewish community? Why doesn't those Arab leaders, all of them now have a stop in DC with the Jewish organization leadership? Why aren't they meeting you guys?
Thank you. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Alexander Frumkin. I am a student at Duke University. My question is, in regards to the Gaza protests that are ongoing, does it indicate, is it indicative of change in the discourse within Palestine, or at least within Gaza, in terms of what wants to happen in regards to Israel and the Palestinian territories? And will this be a catalyst for change within the region, as well as in terms of external pressure from other Muslim majority nations?
Hi, I'm Sam from the Heschel High School. It seems that Israel has, in recent years, been pushing for relations outside of Arab countries, for example, Cyprus. So how does different conflicts in, for example, Cyprus with northern Cyprus affect Israel's relation with other potential allies, for example, Turkey regarding northern Cyprus, or other potential allies, for example, Morocco or the African Union regarding the Western Sahara?
Hello, my name is Stephen Pearl. I'm a former fellow at the International Rescue Committee. And my question is, you guys spoke about how important it is to keep the U.S. presence in the Middle East for Israel, but with the Abbas, with the Palestinian Authority, discounting the U.S. as a mediator in the peace process right now with the recent announcement of Jerusalem as the capital, or moving the embassy to Jerusalem. Do you think that we're going to have to wait until the next administration comes in to have a peace process really resume, peace process negotiations resume, or are we going to find a new mediator to really take charge of that, or is it going to come from within? Thank you.
So I think we could have another hour conversation on those 3 questions alone, but we have 3 minutes. I think we can stretch to 5. I'm going to try. Lucy, do you want to start?
So I will try to be very quick and pick up on a couple of the things I heard. I'm not sure I got all of them, but I think starting from the end, a new mediator. I think one of the challenges on finding a new mediator right now is, for many reasons that have already been discussed. We've discussed certainly how the Arab world is distracted with many other issues right now, which has made maybe the Palestinian issue lower priority for it. And I think the same could be said for the European countries. And I think for as long as the U.S. administration is saying, which it continues to say, there is a peace plan forthcoming and we're trying to do this, the other countries, the Europeans who might be the more immediate example or thought as to who might step up, are able to say, there's no void to be filled here. The Americans are still in the game. They still have a plan. Let's wait to see what they put out, and we'll be happy there to be helpful. But I don't see and to be sort of stepping up in place of, not to mention the fact that it's unclear who both parties, and I mean both parties, would be able to accept as an alternate mediator. So I don't see that being a prospect any time soon. The first question was about the current Gaza protests. Are we seeing a change of discourse? I think there's a whole conversation to be had about what nonviolent civil mobilization could look like in the Palestinian case, and what that would mean eventually for the outcome or for changing the trajectory of the peace process. That's not quite what we're looking at right now. Again, this was a movement that started grassroots. Hamas sort of stepped in and tried to kind of take over the movement, and now you have this sort of muddled message, and it's unclear who the discourse is coming from. And so in terms of, does this speak to a change of discourse, there might be in there pockets of potential we could look at for other avenues, but I'm not sure that this itself is necessarily signifying a new course.
Nadav?
I would like to say on the third question, and to use it also as maybe a constructive criticism out of love to J Street. I hope they are not closing the stream view. I think that we have to, even though with all the problem within the Palestinians and Trump, you don't see anyone else stepping up. The Europeans are waiting for the Americans. Everybody is waiting for the Americans. Europe is divided. They can't really get a consensus on anything. So I guess even if we would like to think that, we need other players, America is still very important. And I think it would be a mistake to completely give up the possibility that Trump will do the right thing for the two-state solution, both because he have amazing leverage that Obama never had, he was accepted as a messiah by the Israeli right, and it will be very hard for Netanyahu to say no to Trump. And until midterm elections, he doesn't have any other party to go to because Trump has both houses. So I would encourage J Street and to be in touch with the administration and not to be partisan on the other side, because I think it is important that you guys will have more Republicans connections and not to give up on this administration, even if we're skeptic, because I think they could still do the right thing, and everybody should try to affect that.
Nimrod, closing comments?
Yeah. So first, it's important to look at the alliances that Israel is forging with different countries, also to understand the constraint for regional issues and peace process. And what is happening with Europe is not by chance that Europe is divided. It's because Israel has proactively developed relations with countries in Central and Eastern Europe. Some of those are not very committed to democratic values as we all see them. And these countries are blocking now initiatives on Israel-Palestine within Brussels. But Israel is also developing alliances in the Eastern Mediterranean. And you mentioned Cyprus. Greece is also an example. It manages to create some sort of a win-win relationship in Israel in that region, has ties with Egypt, has ties with Cyprus, has ties with Greece, has ties with Turkey. And that may be a new frame through which to look at part of the Palestinian issue, at least on Gaza, which is also part of the Eastern Mediterranean, an area in which there are natural resources, that may be another kind of constructive driving force for cooperation. So Eastern Mediterranean issues, I think we should keep an eye on, not only from economy and European relation, but also on Middle Eastern and peace process related issues.
Two very brief comments. One, I think what's going on in Gaza is potentially very interesting and goes well beyond the immediate pressures on the Hamas leadership inside Gaza. This is what happens when you have an Israeli political elite and an Israeli political dynamic that moves so far away from the prospect of two states, it generates a counter-reaction. And the fact that this is marches of return. By the way, most Gazans come from the Negev, the Nakab, the area that Gaza's hinterland is. So the fact that this is front and center is very significant. Secondly, I don't want to wait for the Trump administration to put forward a plan. Thank you very much. I don't want to wait for new mediators. I don't want to wait for the next U.S. administration. I would like America to be a less negative and destructive actor. But what we need to focus on is to change the power dynamics, change the incentive and disincentive structure for Israel on the Palestine issue, so that Israel finally has to make a choice which it has avoided for far too long at its peril.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists. I think we've heard a lot.
Thank you.
Enjoy it. Look at me.